Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for Sundays at Home, a time for conversation and discovering more about the women who have helped shape our world but have been largely underrepresented in our historical narrative. My name is Emma Rothberg, and I'm the Associate Educator of Digital Learning and Innovation at the National Women's History Museum, and I will be your host today. The National Women's History Museum exists to preserve, illuminate, and share the powerful history of women in America, highlighting both the past and present. NWHM seeks to ensure that women's history is available and accessible to learners of all ages across the globe. Our guests are available to answer your questions, so please use the Q&A feature on the tool ribbon to ask any questions that you may have regarding the presentation. You may submit your questions at any time. Some of them will be answered during the presentation, but we're certainly going to leave time to answer those questions at the end. So from the National Halls of Congress to the local streets of Washington, D.C., join the National Women's History Museum for a virtual tour of the nation's capital. We are excited to be joined by a tour of her own for this virtual guided experience. This afternoon, we will explore historical sites and stories central to women's political engagement and feminist movements throughout American history. A Tour of Her Own, or Toho, is the first tourism company in Washington, D.C. to focus exclusively on women's history. Toho specializes in historical tours, special events, consulting, and virtual experiences. And with that, I would love to introduce our two guests today. Calagera is the founder and president of Toho. After recognizing a lack of women's representation in public spaces, she founded Toho. Calagera became a professional tour guide because she believes in education beyond the classroom and that tourism has the power to ignite social change. Her book, 111 Places in Women's History That You Must Not Miss, is a travel guidebook that encourages readers to explore sites and stories about women, many of whom are overlooked in traditional textbooks. As an avid traveler and researcher, she believes in the idea that we all belong, but sometimes have to search deeper for the people, places, and stories we connect with most. Rebecca Grawl is a founding member of and currently Vice President of Education at Toho. She is a professional tour guide, historian, and author who holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in American Culture from Randolph-Macon Women's College, which is now Randolph College. She has over a decade's experience in tourism, public history, and museum education. She works with a wide array of companies, organizations, and audiences to bring our nation's history to life in engaging and innovative ways. Rebecca Grawl can be seen on Mysteries at the Museum on the Travel Channel and heard as a lead contributor for the Tour Guide Tells All podcast. She is a past board member of the National Women's Party and a consultant for Above Glass Ceilings, a firm dedicated to advancing women in the workplace. She is also a co-author of 111 Places in Women's History That You Must Not Miss. I'm really looking forward to this guided tour. Thank you so much for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Caitlin and Rebecca to the screen.
Hi, Emma. Thank you so much for that excellent introduction. I'm super excited to be here today and share this program with all of you. So thank you to our audience, and thank you to the National Women's History Museum for having us. As Emma recognized, this is my colleague and Vice President, Rebecca Grawl, and her and I are going to start the program off just by having a little bit of a conversation, introducing you to our work before we get into the actual virtual tour. So, Becca, what's going on? Let's chat. Tell me a little bit about why you're excited to be here today talking about this topic.
Well, I'm just so excited for the National Women's History Museum to be partnering with us as we have partnered with them in the past. And we share such mutual goals and sort of sharing and spreading the story of women's history and really talking about and bringing it to undiscovered narratives. And I think that's a big part of what we do as tour guides. We are very much here to sort of bring to light stories, to uncover what often may seem as kind of this hidden history. And we often do it in sort of a place-based setting. So much of what we do is kind of on the street. So this is really fun for me, getting to be in a virtual setting where we get to sort of explore with no limit to how far we can physically walk within an hour's time. So I'm really excited to be here, and I appreciate the museum for hosting us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sort of reflecting on this opportunity, and I couldn't help but kind of laugh a little bit because when I became a tour guide about 7 years ago, one of the first things that we sort of talk about is not being political on tour and having a sort of neutral narrative. And then here we are today, specifically being asked to present about women in politics. But I think it just shows that, women's history is political history. And there certainly are ways to present that in a way that is responsible and approachable and relatable. And I hope that's what we can do here today with this virtual tour. But, then again, some of these stories I just, want to say are might be a little uncomfortable, might be a little bit edgy, but part of, I think, being a public historian and being a storyteller is, challenging some of the narratives that we might already have from our own personal experiences, and really just thinking critically about that. I know, I've been a tour guide in DC for 7 years. I've lived here for 8 years, and this is the nation's capital. It is a city where events are going on constantly, people are coming through. It is the heart of America's politics. I do always say, though, that DC has a lot to offer outside of the federal government. We have a booming theater and art scene. We have lots of sports activities, just everything that you can imagine. And that's important. And I'm going to try to highlight on that on the tour today as well. But Becca, I know you're always out on the streets doing walking tours like I am. What do you feel about your experience as a tour guide, meeting people from all across the country, all across the world, and presenting an American narrative or presenting the culture of DC? What kind of challenges comes up when we talk about it from a political perspective and a women's perspective?
That's a really, really great question. And I think it's interesting what you mentioned about sort of when you start in this industry. I started a little bit more than 10 years ago, and there was sort of this mindset of don't be political, you have to be objective, be neutral. And that in and of itself is almost a political choice, to be neutral and to sort of be objective and to only talk about the history that somebody has deemed as not too difficult and easy to swallow is in and of itself a political choice. And so over the course of doing this over the last decade, I've really learned to sort of reframe what I think of as, political versus non-political, and what is part of, you said, sort of that American narrative. How do we define what that means? What is American? And for me, that's diversity of storytelling and diversity of narrative, and looking at all the voices that have shaped our nation. I think what's really interesting about what we do is we could be interacting with any range of people in a given day. Somebody who has been in this country their entire life, deeply rich in its history, really, really knowledgeable. We could have somebody who has never really thought about history, maybe didn't connect with it in school and is just now starting to try to understand it. Or we can have people visiting from all around the world who are bringing very different perspectives and sometimes an outsider's perspective. So something that I love about being a tour guide is that it's not one way, it's not static, it's not I'm here to tell you what I know and that's it. It's about us discovering and learning together and having a conversation. And I think more and more as I do this, it makes me think of things like this, where we're really, it's a give and take. It's unpacking together. It's uncovering together. And that's what's really, I think, interesting about being in DC is you have real opportunities to look at things with fresh eyes all the time and new perspectives.
Yeah, definitely. I think you brought up some good points about moving around. This is part of our job. Today I know we're on a screen, which is a little bit different than, actually being on a walking tour. But if you're watching, you can actually, stand up, stretch out, go on a little walk around the room if it makes you feel better. But it does give us the opportunity to go and find physical, tangible evidence of the women's experience in DC and beyond. And Rebecca, as Emma had mentioned, is my co-author in our book 100. Oh, look at us. We just both had it ready. 111 Places in Women's History That You Must Not Miss. And when we started writing this book, we thought we were going to have to really expand outside of DC or be interpretive. But we found so many places and sites that illustrate women's experiences in DC. So I explain that to you because we identify as public historians. Yes, we're authors, we have history backgrounds, But our public history is really meant to be approachable. It's meant to not us just be up here, talking about dates and facts, but showing you how they show up in the real world and show you how they kind of weave through our experiences. So today on our virtual tour, you will go to some of these sites, and some of what we'll experience are more stories and maybe some things that you can find in a history book, but we're going to give you some places that actually connect to them. So if you come to DC, you can go check it out. You can come on one of our tours and you can go and visit. So with that, we're going to start the virtual tour now. And while I'm getting it set up on the screen, I would love for all of you to use the chat box. Please let us know if you've ever visited DC, where you're from, maybe some personal reflections you have about sites and stories that you remember seeing. A lot of people come here on their 8th grade trip. That's fine if that's your experience. If you've come with kids, alone, whatever it is, let us know. Let us know what you remember. Also, because this is a political engagement themed tour, let us know if you've ever marched, if you've ever rallied, protested, any experiences with voting. We really just want to encourage, you using the chat box and sharing some of your thoughts with us. So it's not just me speaking the whole time, but we also get an idea of who's in the room and who's sharing this space with us. So go ahead, use the chat box, and I will go ahead and get us started. All right, excellent. So here we are just sort of on our introduction screen. A tour of our own. We offer women's history tours. We offer virtual tours. And this one, Hear Her Roar, we actually have a physical version. It starts by the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and it moves along Pennsylvania Avenue toward the White House. So this is a real tour that we've adapted into a virtual space, which is really super exciting because what you're going to see throughout this tour is that I can incorporate a lot of resources that when you're on a walking tour around busy streets and you have a big group, sometimes isn't always possible. So just a little bit of what to expect while you're on this tour. Lots of video clips. I think one of the things that's important about being a historian and being a storyteller is incorporating other voices. Right? I like to be a facilitator. I'm a guide. But at the end of the day, there are so many voices and so many different people who have, certain styles and ways of saying things and sharing their perspective. So I really wanted to add a lot of video clips into this tour today. So I hope that you enjoy those. As far as what kind of sites and stories and places we're going to go to, when I was thinking about, what does it mean to be politically engaged? And as we move into sort of election season here in the United States, I was thinking about, what is it important for us to know, to think about, to contemplate? And so I of course, being in DC, I start this tour with women who have been involved in the legislative branch and the executive branch. So women in Congress and even women who have run for president, and we're going to meet them today. But, part of the political process in the United States of America as a democracy is, serving in elected office, voting, having those representatives serving as the voice of the people. So we're going to take a different look at people who have done that. And, to differentiate this program from, other ones, what I again try to do is really not only focus on this sort of federal narrative of Congress and the presidency, but also really zoom in on the local culture of DC, because there's a lot of legacy from things that have happened in history that we can see right here, whether it's local businesses, local artwork, murals, things like that. So I'm going to point some really specific to DC things out so you can feel like you're here with us in the nation's capital. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the chat box. Rebecca will be kind of monitoring that. And if she can answer questions, she will. We might do it in the middle of the program, or at the end, we will definitely hold space for your questions. So again, this is your tour. Please feel free to engage and involve yourself. A couple of themes that I sort of came up with along the way were, this idea of political engagement that I talked about, serving in office and voting, but also how it almost always interacts with activism. The description of this tour states from the halls of Congress to the streets of DC. And so you'll see that sort of evolve throughout the tour, things happening in the office and in the house gallery and whatnot, but also things unfolding on the streets in the way of activism and protests and rallies and whatnot. Those things often go hand in hand. I think also what I really love about women's history, and I try to illustrate in this tour in several areas, is how it's intergenerational. So often we see women's stories being preserved by their granddaughters, for instance. And so I really try to show how, the past is not only the past, but it definitely is the present. It has lasting effects on the world that we live in today. So with that, we are going to go ahead and start our presentation. I thought what I would do to just give some context is go through this map of DC here. It's really great. I can interact with it. It's just on Google Maps. If you're local to DC, I'm sure you have some idea of how the city is situated. If you're not local, I want to just give you that idea because, again, we are place-based learning. It helps to have a visual to understand maybe some of the places that we're talking about. So you can see this outline here, this red dotted line. That is the border of Washington, D.C. Originally, it was a diamond shape, but at some point, you can see the border became along the Potomac River there. To the left of your screen, this is Arlington, Virginia, and to the right would be Maryland. So when we talk about DC, we really talk about the DMV area. Now, a lot of people think that DC is the National Mall and the halls of Congress, and that's certainly true, but there are also about 700,000 people that live in DC proper. The city expands far beyond the federal land that we tend to see if we visit for just a few days. But to put that into context a little bit more, this whole green area right here, this is the National Mall, which is just basically a description for America's front yard. It's a big green space that we share. If you've ever been to DC or you've ever watched a special event on TV or in the news, this is where a lot of the protests and rallies and engagement happen. And it was designed with that in mind, to be open, to be inviting, and to have, all kinds of memorials set up around it to help tell our story. But again, if you go through the National Mall, you might even see just on this map here, the Lincoln Memorial, the Thomas Jefferson Memorial, the George Washington statue. There's not a lot of representation of women. Not obvious, I should say, but it's definitely there. And just because women don't have maybe statues all over the place like many of the founding fathers, we will learn that their legacy is just as much in the foundation and the roots of the nation's capital. All right, so one of the first women I'd like to talk about on this tour is a woman named Belva Lockwood. And I say here that she has a building of her own. So we have an extraordinary woman and a place to show you about it. So Belva Lockwood, this is her portrait over here. This is sort of a modern day reimagined portrait of her by artist Leslie Holt. And Belva is being honored because she was the first woman attorney to practice before the Supreme Court. She petitioned and she, it wasn't easy. She had to really not only ask, but demand for the right to do that as a lawyer. But eventually she does become the first female attorney to do that. But then Belva Lockwood goes on to run for president. She arguably is the first or second woman. The first woman was Victoria Woodhull, who wasn't 35 years of age, so it wasn't really official. So Belva Lockwood sort of has the official title of being the first woman to run for president. She's on the ballot for the Equal Rights Party in 1884, and again in 1888. So this is a time period that we're talking about before women even have the federal right to vote in the United States. So she is far ahead of her time here. Now, what we're going to see is we're going to learn a little bit about this building named for her. So you can see right here, it's called the Lockwood. And it is a residential apartment building right here in Washington, D.C. You can kind of see the inside here. This is the lobby. It's just, welcoming. There's a couch. Up here, this is a picture of actually Rebecca and our photographer, Cindy, taking this photo when we went to visit there while we were writing our book. But I want to give you a look on the inside a little bit more. So on the inside, everything is themed to honor Belva Lockwood. This is sort of the Velvet Belva Pub, which we hosted an event in. You can see right here. This is some artwork. It's pottery by a local artist who is, as you can see, putting Belva's image on cups and plates and all of these things. She actually kind of snuck in a picture of her daughter too on one of those pottery dishes, just so that she can kind of be a part of Belva's legacy as well. And I thought that was kind of sweet and clever. But I love this picture over here on the right, and because it shows Belva Lockwood on this really unique bicycle. And one of the reasons she was so successful is because she rode a bike, and it's a little bit wider so that her dress could fit in it and it could be comfortable, because they weren't really made for women who were wearing this kind of wardrobe back then. But Belva was, very observant of the culture around her. And she noticed that the male lawyers in the city were getting around really fast. They could get from one building to another in double or triple the time because they were riding bicycles. And what she realized was that men were being more productive at work. They were able to network more. They were able to really, get more done because of the bicycle. So sure enough, she got herself a bicycle, and this is what she was known for, riding it around town. People say you could see Belva just go from one place to another super quick. Sometimes she was even seen with a little parrot on her shoulder. So definitely a bit of a unique woman, but smart and absolutely resourceful. So not only does Belva have, I call her Belva because she's a friend of ours now. We really love her in Toho. But not only does she have this building in DC, but her final resting place is also in Washington, DC, at a local cemetery called Congressional Cemetery. So I have this map here to give you some idea of where you are. This would be the Capitol building. And then on the east side of the Capitol, you have the Lockwood apartment building here. And just a few blocks away is Congressional Cemetery. That's where she's buried. And Congressional Cemetery is absolutely amazing. Locals love it. There's really so many interesting people buried there. It's a great place to go and visit. But Belva Lockwood is buried there. I'm going to show you her headstone. There you go, right there, Belva Lockwood. I think maybe we have to go and give it a good power washing, but nevertheless, she is represented there, and that's really great that people can go and visit. Now, I wanted to show you Congressional Cemetery and the Lockwood building because the two have a bit of a relation to each other. When the apartment building was being built, it didn't have a name, and it sort of was this completed building. All it needed was a name, and the staff was trying to figure out what would be appropriate. So one day they went out on a little field trip to Congressional Cemetery, and they're getting a tour by one of the docents there, and they learn about Belva Lockwood's story. And it was like they knew at that point that she was a woman to be remembered and that this building should be named after her. So it's a great story just in general, but I love it because we see how tourism and how visiting places can inspire us to, bring it back home with us, to do more with the things that we have seen. Now, we're going to move forward and learn a little bit more about the presidency, but I do want to point out here, this is Belva Lockwood's obituary. She dies at 85 years old, but I love this line right here. The only woman who ran for the presidency, the only woman, but that won't be true forever. So let's take a look at that. How many women have run for president? I'm going to hold this screen for a few seconds, maybe a minute, and I'd like for you to drop it in the chat if you have any ideas whatsoever. How many total women have run for president? There's no wrong answers. 4 women, 4 women. 6, 2. All right, well, let's take a look. 23 women have run for president. 23 women. This is according to the Center for American Women and Politics, based out of Rutgers University. And I have them all listed here for you. Again, Victoria Woodhull may be a little bit controversial because she wasn't, of age, but she is listed there. These other women have ended up on some kind of official ballot one way or another, perhaps for the primaries, mostly for the primaries, really. But we see here Belva Lockwood, 1884 and 1888 for the Equal Rights Party. And then we jump into the 1960s, Margaret Chase Smith, Shirley Chisholm, Patsy Takemoto Mink. We're going to learn more about those women, but I just think it's really interesting to look over this list. Some of these names are recognizable, some of them not at all. The dates are interesting. The parties are so interesting to me. And then if you look kind of to more modern times, as the years go on, there's more and more representation. So let's meet some of those women who have run for president, and particularly ones who have some presence here in DC. Shirley Chisholm, she has this portrait that you see here inside the United States Capitol building. Shirley Chisholm is the first African-American woman in Congress in 1968, and then in 1972, she goes on to run for president. This portrait that you see here, the artist is Kadir Nelson, and it's part of the U.S. House of Representatives collection. Now, I absolutely love this quote that Shirley Chisholm has said. I read it on this tour live and sometimes just on other tours because it seems so relevant. So I'm going to read it out loud to you today. Women in this country must become revolutionaries. We must refuse to accept the traditional roles and stereotypes. We must replace the old negative thoughts about our femininity with positive thoughts and positive action affirming it and more. But we must also remember that we will be breaking with tradition. And so we must prepare ourselves educationally, economically, and psychologically in order that we will be able to accept and bear with the sanctions that society will immediately impose upon us. Wow, it's a heavy quote. It is a meaningful quote. I find it to be celebratory and also a little bit cautionary. And I think it speaks so much to the sort of grit that Shirley Chisholm had. Now, I mentioned to you that I really wanted to share some video clips because I can sit here all day and tell you about Shirley Chisholm, but I think it's a different experience when you actually get to hear from the women themselves or actually experience, kind of being there with them. So this particular clip is from her 1972 announcement that she will become a presidential candidate.
I do not believe that in 1972, the great majority of Americans will continue to harbor such narrow and petty prejudices. I am convinced that the American people are in a mood to discard the politics and the political personalities of the past. I believe that they will show in 1972 and thereafter that they intend to make independent judgments on the merits of a particular candidate based on that candidate's intelligence, character, physical ability, competence, integrity, and honesty. It is, I feel, the duty of responsible leaders in this country to encourage and maximize, not to dismiss or minimize such judgment. Our will can create a new America in 1972, one where there is freedom from violence and war at home and abroad, where there is freedom from poverty and discrimination, where there exists at least the feeling that we are making progress in ensuring for everyone medical care, employment, and decent housing, where we more decisively clean up our streets, our water, and our air, where we work together, black and white, to rebuild our neighborhoods and to make our cities quiet, attractive, and efficient. And fundamentally, where we live in the confidence that every man and every woman in America has at long last the opportunity to become all that he was created of being, such as is his ability. In conclusion, all of you who share this vision, from New York to California, from Wisconsin to Florida, are brothers and sisters on the road to national unity and a new America.
So, Shirley Chisholm, we mentioned that there is a portrait of her in the United States Capitol building. There is also a beautiful portrait of Shirley Chisholm at Hotel Zena, which is a local hotel established just in 2020. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But the portrait that you see right here on the left was done by artist Chanel Compton. She's based out of Baltimore, so fairly local. It's titled Shirley Chisholm for the Win. You can see here the word vote. There are some newspaper clippings, and it's a little bit of an abstract look at her. This is the up close version, but it's actually on this wall in Hotel Zena. Here's the portrait. You can see this is actually Rosa Parks down here. So she's in good company on display at the hotel. Now, I wanted to introduce you today to Hotel Zena, and I wanted to bring you inside to see what this hotel is all about, because it is absolutely in alignment with talking about women's engagement civically and politically within Washington, D.C. Now, in 2020, we all remember that year, right? We don't have to stay there and talk about it for too long, but I remember driving through Washington, D.C. at a time when things looked dark. It looked dark for hospitality and tourism and small businesses. And I just remember looking at this building that you see here on the right, which would become Hotel Zena, and this amazing mural being painted on the side of it. This mural is by an artist, Miss Shea Love, and it's supposed to represent women as warriors and guardians. So you can imagine how inspiring that was when, we didn't really know what the next steps were for the tourism and hospitality industries. But you can see them here. They're colorful. This building is probably 12 floors high. So the mural is quite large, and you can see it, just by driving around the area. If you're walking, it's extremely inspiring. So actually the inside is just as cool. Let's go take a look. So this is some of the inside. I have a bunch of pictures to show you. We've done a lot of work with Hotel Zena, and it's been really exciting because, as I mentioned to you earlier, there isn't always physical representation to be able to show people, women's faces or women's stories. But as soon as you walk into the lobby at Hotel Zena, It is exactly that. They actually kind of identify themselves as part hotel and part museum, which I would agree that when you walk in there, you feel like you're in a bit of a museum, but it's interactive and it's engaging. The designer of the hotel is a woman named Andrea Sheehan of Dawson Design and Associates. Andrea designed this to be very feminine, you know, particularly here in DC, but most places that you travel. When you walk into a hotel, there tend to be masculine features. There's a lot of dark wood, and just even think about right angles and, you know, leather and all of this, blacks and browns and, you know, just darker colors. And what she wanted to do was design a hotel that would be more feminine. So the design of it has a curvier structure. It's more open. It's very inviting. And as soon as you walk in, you go to the lobby, the front desk here, and the glass is made up of all high heel shoes. So I don't know if there's anything more feminine than high heel shoes. So even when you're checking in or checking out, you're looking at this beautiful art display. Now, a couple of other things on display there is this wall of fame. And as you can see, there are so many women, dozens and dozens of women represented there, kind of in an etching, like a black and white portrait style. There's no names, there's no stories. It is a very visual representation of diverse women, not only American women, but international as well. And then over here on the right, this is a really neat part of the hotel lobby. It's when you walk inside, it's kind of like an oval or a horseshoe. And it's a picture, almost a 360 picture of the 2017 Women's March. You can see some of the signs here, diversity makes America great, so on and so forth. So you can kind of stand there and take a selfie, and it looks like you're standing right there in the middle of the march. It's quite fun. And if you look closely enough, all the way down here on the bottom right, this woman right here, anybody recognize her? Right here with the glasses. Look closely. That's Gloria Steinem. Really, really, really well-known feminist who was, in fact, at the 2017 Women's March. Just a little bit more visuals about Hotel Zena. This section right here is also in the lobby. What you see there is meant to look a little bit like a sequin gown. Again, it's very curvy, it's shiny, it's glittery, kind of like a fancy dress. And what the glittery, shiny parts are, when you get close to it, are protest buttons. So buttons that say, you know, vote for the ERA or call me Ms. or, you know, all different kinds of causes that the feminist movement throughout time have championed. Now on the left here, that's me. And that is the designer, Andrea Sheehan. I had an amazing opportunity to meet with her. She's quite wonderful. And we are standing, I wanted to put our picture in there because I wanted to give you the scale of the artwork behind us. We're standing in front of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You can see the word right here. It says notorious. And it really truly is larger than life. And when you go close up to this image of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, what you find out is that it is made up all of tampons. I said tampons. Yeah, I know. Very clever, very feminine, and people just absolutely love it. It's something that when you come to DC, you should check out. Get up nice and close to it and see the details. Some other elements in the hotel here, you have these like rib cage, kind of representing Adam and Eve. And it goes all the way around the lobby, kind of in reference to the old "Don't Tread on Me" motto of the early founding of the country. Now down here on the bottom right is me and Rebecca, who we met, and a really special person in Washington, D.C. This is Natasha Cloud. Natasha Cloud is one of the star players of our women's professional basketball team, which is called the Washington Mystics. And you can see we're standing in front of this wall. We had a little event there with them, and we got to lead some of the Mystics community on a tour. So I thought that this would be a good kind of segue to teach you more about the Washington Mystics. Because when you talk about Washington, D.C., and you talk about political engagement, these players in this organization really are on the front line of sort of the activism that comes with being engaged in the nation's capital. And I think also when you talk about, women's culture and progress, sports really is a major piece of that. Here in DC, we have two major sports teams. The other one is two professional women's sports teams. The other one is the Spirit, which I'll tell you about. But the Mystics have been really strong advocates for all kinds of causes, and local and national. Now, when you come to DC, one of the great things to do is go and see one of their games. At the top here, I don't know if you can see it because mine's blocked a little bit, but it says a stadium of her own. And the Mystics now play at the Entertainment and Sports Arena. Here again is a map of DC. So you have the National Mall, that's the Capitol building. And then across the river here, the Anacostia River, their stadium is right down here. So it's not in the middle of town, but that's okay because it's really a good destination to go and support the local team. The Mystics previously did not have a stadium of their own. They shared space with the men's professional Wizards team and so on and so forth, which is pretty common. But when they moved to this stadium in 2019, they won their first championship in franchise history. And so this was very revolutionary and exciting for the city. And also, I think, an example of how having your own space, a room of one's own, for instance, a stadium of one's own, can really be a motivator and help women excel into higher and better places. Another reason I really wanted to introduce you to the Mystics today is because they are really not afraid to take a stance and make a statement. Now, you see here, recently, in the past couple of years, they introduced their Rebel edition of their jersey. So this isn't what their jersey typically looks like. It's very special. It's their Rise jersey, or they call it their Rebel jersey. And it is in honor of the 2017 Women's March. They recognize this as a historic moment in time. This uniform was released right around the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which would have been 2020. And so the Mystics wore these uniforms for that season. Now, the way they designed these uniforms was to with really specific and intricate details. Up top here, this pink part, the color is an ode to the Women's March. If you remember, women were wearing pink hats at the time. It was like a flood of pink throughout Washington, D.C. And it's meant to represent the path, sort of the roadway that women were taking together. And then what I love most about this too is right in here, this really, really small print, it's almost in script, are the words of the 19th Amendment, the 19th Amendment that helped secure voting rights for women across the United States. Even inside, there's really small, intricate details that help honor and share this messaging. Just here, for instance, the little tag inside says, "shall not be denied." Those are words taken directly from the 19th Amendment, shall not be denied. There was also an exhibit at the Library of Congress with this phrase, and it really is a motto that a lot of feminists have used throughout various movements. Here you can see some of the team is wearing the uniforms, and we will skip on. I want to introduce you now to the Washington Spirit. This is our professional soccer team. So I think it's really unique that we have two professional women's teams in the city. This is really rare. Women's sports, often are not have equal representation to men's sports within a city. And when you do have this presence, it really says something about the kind of feminism and the kind of equality I think a city has. So just to give you a little bit of background here, the original soccer team in DC was called the Washington Freedom. They played at RFK Stadium, which is basically about to be demolished. It's no longer used. It was in the city, but it hasn't been in service for quite some time. In 2012, they were sort of rebranded as the Washington Spirit as they joined the National Women's Soccer League. So the Washington Spirit, as we know it, have been established for quite some time now in the past decade. Now, what's important to understand about this team is that they do not have a field of their own. They kind of split their games between Segra Field and Audi Field. The field that you see on the screen here, this is Audi Field, AUDI. They share this with the professional men's team, DC United, but they don't have all of their games here. In fact, for quite a bit of time, most of their games have been at Segra Field, which is almost an hour outside of Washington, D.C. It's in Loudoun County, Virginia. So why is this important? Well, when we're talking about representation and visibility, you have to be visible for people to understand and relate and be able to cheer for you and show up for you. And so now as the Spirit is getting more support and more visibility, we see again how that has helped the success of the program. What I love most, I think, about this team is their investors. Their investors are very diverse. And two that I like to point out specifically include first daughters, Chelsea Clinton and Jenna Bush Hager. So when people say that DC is not bipartisan, I just share this example with them and say, well, we have two first daughters investing in the same program. And that program went on to win their first championship just last year in 2021. You can see how they are celebrating down here. For me, this is an example of when you invest in women, you see the success and you see the kinds of contributions that they've made come to the surface. And as we move into some other stories and we go back to sort of the halls of Congress throughout this tour, we're going to learn how a lot of our representatives have pushed for economic freedom, for equality in sports and whatnot. One last thing to point out about women's soccer here in Washington, D.C. is a very local event that just took place. I think most people are pretty aware that the United States women's national soccer team has been front and center, very active, very vocal about equal pay. The women's national team is very successful. They fill the stadiums, and yet their paychecks were not reflecting that. This has been an ongoing struggle, including many lawsuits, many media and press campaigns. And just this year, September 6th, 2022, we finally saw some of this come to a conclusion. And not only did we see women's soccer players signing off on equal pay with U.S. soccer, but it happened right here in Washington, D.C. It happened right here at Audi Field. We see equal pay for women's soccer players coming out of this women's national team game that they played. In DC, we love to say this, but steps away from the Capitol, history was being made. Now, let's move away from our professional teams for a little bit. And I want to introduce you to a congresswoman named Patsy Mink. Patsy Mink is pictured here on the screen. That portrait that you see of her on the right, this is artist Sharon Sprung. It's from the 2022 collection on the U.S. House of Representatives. So this portrait is inside the United States Capitol building. Why is a congresswoman, how does that tie into this story of women's soccer and the mystics and the spirit? Well, because Patsy Mink was a co-sponsor of Title IX. And Title IX in 1972 essentially helped ensure that women would have equal funding in education. So a lot of the time that meant sports in schools. Title IX states no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. This was huge. This was a game changer. After Title IX was law, we saw participation numbers for middle school and high school female athletes skyrocket, like 1,000% over. And by Patsy Mink being influential in passing this, really offered a lot of women opportunity. And, you know, it's the kind of movement, though, that has taken decades for us to really see, because sometimes, you know, as much as showing up on the National Mall and chanting has an impact, we do also see that women's engagement is slow moving, and it takes decades to really come into effect. Patsy Mink has been quoted talking about her legacy and her involvement with Title IX, and I wanted to share some of those quotes with you today. In 1970, so as she was working on this legislation, she said, discrimination against women in education is one of the most insidious forms of prejudice existent in our nation. Few people realize the extent to which our society is denied full use of our human resources because of this type of discrimination. Now, later on in her life in 2001, as Title IX had been entering into the foundation of our education system, she reflected back and said this: I consider Title IX to be one of my most significant accomplishments as a member of Congress, and I take special pride in honoring its contributions to changing our view about women's role in America. Now, that portrait that I showed you has just been unveiled in the United States Capitol building. You can see some live photos from that ceremony here. The background behind Patsy Mink is meant to represent the Pacific Ocean. She was a congresswoman from Hawaii. We'll learn a little bit more about that on the next slide. But the blues are supposed to be that water and that nature coming forward. And on the left here, this is her daughter, Wendy. What I love about this picture is the setup, the environment. This is the United States Capitol building. It is National Statuary Hall. In the Capitol, there are 100 statues. Every single state gets 2 statues. They get to decide who they want to represent them. And often these statues are here for decades. Of those 100 statues, as you can imagine, the representation of women is quite low. I believe we are at 11 women, 11 out of 100. Now, what I love about these photos is that we can see 2 of those statues in the background. So right here, this is Frances Willard. And then over here, sitting down, is Rosa Parks. And Rosa Parks actually was commissioned by Congress, so she doesn't count as one of those 11. She wasn't given as a state statue. But nevertheless, we love that we can see all of these women in the same space as they are being celebrated. I mentioned a little bit about Patsy Mink. In the 1950s, she fights for Hawaii statehood. So Hawaii was not a state, and this was part of her main campaign. Now, in the 60s, she wins a seat in the Hawaiian State Senate. And then, as Hawaii becomes a state, she finds this as an opportunity to serve in Congress. In 1964, she's elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, making her the first Asian American woman to serve in Congress. Patsy Mink does not stop there. If you remember earlier when I put that slide up of 23 women who have run for president, she is one of the earliest. In 1972, she runs for president. Her story is one of resilience and persistence. I'm going to play this video clip for you, and what you're going to see is her daughter, Wendy, who we just saw in that last photo, talking about her mother's legacy, not only her struggles and her challenges, but her contributions and how she overcame a lot of that adversity in her life.
My father was at the University of Chicago as a graduate student in geology and geophysics. Their eyes met. They knew they were made for each other. He would blast opera. They got married in January of 1951, Patsy Takemoto Mink. And in March of 1952, she had one kid. Which was me, Wendy. After law school, nobody would hire her.
She might make you a darn good employee. What's wrong with her? She's a woman, isn't she?
She said, I'm going to have to find a different path. If a law firm had been willing to hire her in Chicago, she wouldn't have gone back to Hawaii. If I can't get hired, I'm going to run for office. There was just no stopping her. Now, at this point, Hawaii was a territory. So in 1956, she ran for the Territorial House of Representatives. She won.
Representative Patsy Takemoto Mink.
I think that the time has come for the American people and for the Congress of the United States to search its conscience and to recall back to 1898 the promise they gave to the people of Hawaii upon annexation that when we were ready, we would become a state.
I don't think that the people there know enough about the problem to cast an intelligent vote or make intelligent decisions.
It's no longer a question of pleading for statehood, to my mind. It's a question of rising up in indignation. I feel that the people here are ready and want statehood.
Hawaii's voters, faced with the first opportunity to participate in the nation's government, responded with a record ballot cast by 93% of those eligible.
When statehood was declared, this was her chance to go to Washington.
All right, so Patsy Mink, you know, again, a national legacy, but I love that she sort of started fighting for statehood. And I'm going to take this opportunity to transition into local DC statehood, because Washington, DC is not a state. We have a complicated situation as far as representation. But there has been a huge push for statehood locally. And one of those women who was at the lead of that is a woman named Josephine Butler, who you see here on the screen. She was a founder and chairman of the DC Statehood Party going back towards the 70s and the 80s. She's also an advocate for the environment and local parks. And she's really like leading her community, not only for statehood, but for the environment and climate and human rights and social justice and labor rights and all of that. There are two particular markers here in DC where you can find Josephine Butler. One is this amazing mural on the side of a building. You can see the statehood here. Those 3 stars and these 2 red lines are representative of the DC flag. Now down here, there's 2 images. This is a call box. You can actually see this is from one of our tours. That's Rebecca leading a tour. There are 8 call boxes dedicated specifically 2 women in Washington, D.C. There are hundreds throughout the whole city telling all kinds of stories, but the 8 women were just added to represent local and national history, and Josephine Butler is one of those women. The whole call box is colored white and red to represent the D.C. state flag. And over here, you can see there's kind of a metal cutout of her, and it says her name just on the side. Now, another advocate for DC statehood is our congressional representative, Eleanor Holmes Norton. She currently serves in the House, but she has a very, very long history of being an equal rights advocate. She was chairwoman of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and she has served in Congress for nearly 15 terms, about 30 years now. In DC, there are several murals that represent Congresswoman Norton. These are 2 different artists. This one on the left here, this is near Ben's Chili Bowl, which is a really well-known DC establishment. And then the one on the right here, you can see sort of has the Capitol building behind her. I want to share with you this quote that the Congresswoman had said about DC statehood. Allowing the nearly 700,000 Americans who live in the nation's capital to continue to live as second-class citizens betrays the spirit of July 4th itself. District residents not only pay federal taxes without voting representation in Congress, they pay more federal taxes per capita than the citizens of any state in the nation. July 4th summons our moral outrage to continue our fight for statehood and full equality for DC residents. So as I said, it is a bit complicated. We do have a congressional member in Congress, but she does not have a vote in Congress. And so there is a push for statehood locally in DC. Now we're going to move into the U.S. Capitol building, and I wanted to highlight a couple of really interesting stories within the Capitol. Now, the Capitol has like hundreds and hundreds of rooms, and there are about 30 of them that are named mostly for congressional representatives. Of those 30, there are 4 named for women who have served in Congress. We have the Lindy Claiborne Boggs Congressional Women's Reading Room. We have a room named for Representative Gabby Giffords, one for Senator Margaret Chase Smith, and one for Senator Barbara Mikulski. Now, this room here, this is the first room to be named for a woman. It actually goes back to the 1960s when women needed a space to go and lounge and have a bathroom and all of that. And then in the 1990s, it was named for Lindy Boggs. She has an interesting history. She's part of what's called the widow's mandate, in that her husband had actually died tragically while he was serving in office, and then she stepped into his role. This is quite common. There have been about 45 or 50 women who have done that throughout congressional history. But she's very well respected, and so they named the Congressional Women's Room after her, and I'm going to take you on a little tour through it now.
Couple of things. Who made the decision to name it the Lindy Boggs Room?
Well, that was made in honor of Lindy Boggs, who was a long-serving congresswoman. She succeeded her husband, Hale Boggs. She's part of what we call the widow's mandate, women who succeed their husbands when their husbands die in office. But she went on to have an illustrious career of her own. The Congresswomen's Reading Room was so designated as a room for the Congresswoman in 1962, and it wasn't until a good 30 years later that it was named for Congresswoman Boggs. It's got a long history, and of course, as we've seen, it was the site of where John Quincy Adams died. It was speaker's offices. It was subsequently the office of the clerk of the House. It finally became the Congresswomen's suite because there were women in Congress and no restroom anywhere for them to use. So it finally became that spot for them, a retiring room for them. The Senate didn't come up with bathrooms for women until the 1990s.
A bathroom of her own, I suppose. So a bit of her legacy, which I found to be super interesting. After she had passed, she was a widow and she was trying to manage her credit and her finances for the first time. And she felt like there was a lot of discrimination against widows or single moms or people who were, in this challenging position. So she made it part of her legacy to fight for economic freedoms for women, and she helped pass legislation in Congress for that. On the right here, you might recognize her daughter, Cokie Roberts, really well-known journalist. And this is the two of them at the funeral for Lady Bird Johnson, really beloved First Lady. I thought that was a neat little photo to add. Now, I mentioned there are 2 rooms named for female senators. You can see them here. This was just added in 2022. You have up top here, Barbara Mikulski, and below, Margaret Chase Smith. Margaret Chase Smith is also a senator who's kind of part of that widow's mandate. Her husband became ill, and she would then go on to take his seat in Congress. And she served for an extremely long time. Both of these women are some of the longest serving in Congress. This is Margaret Chase Smith out in front of the Capitol building. She is a Republican. She's self-proclaimed moderate who doesn't necessarily align with liberal feminism. She says that she works to or aims to work within the established order. Now, one of the things she's most known for is the Declaration of Conscience in Conscience, where she calls out McCarthyism in the 1950s and really sets herself aside from both parties to try to bring unity, to try and bring some civility into the House, into the Senate. It's a little video I'm going to skip over for some time purposes here. I want to introduce you to the Barbara Mikulski. So she is the other room named for her in the Senate. Now, she has such an abundant personality, and one of the things that I thought was kind of cute here is that when she got her own room in the Senate, she said she also got a podium of her own. She's a bit on the shorter side, and she said that throughout her congressional career, all the podiums were made for men who were 6'2". And so now with the naming of her room, she finally got a podium to stand at, and you can see her there actually at the dedication ceremony. I love this quote from her. She says, "When the day's over, let's kick back and put on our lipstick and have a glass of wine and keep the institution of America going." Barbara Mikulski was influential in creating the zone of civility within the Senate. What is the zone of civility? It is basically a space, very physical, in that women senators have always met, and they still do to this day, to have monthly dinners with each other. There were 3 rules: no staff, no memos, and no leaks. And Barbara Mikulski really nurtured this idea. It was a place for mentorship. And some of the things that they really came to speak of quite often were things like mammogram standards and quality of breast cancer funding and women's health. And it's really, I think, a unique example of again, civility in American politics. Now, the final room that inside the Capitol named for a woman is named for Gabby Giffords. And she is quite a inspiring and maybe perhaps tragic experience in DC. So she was a representative, and while she was at an event, she became victim of a gun shooting. She would step away from Congress for quite some time and then step back into the movement as an advocate for gun safety. Now, you can see her here. She has a room named for her, and Leo Ryan, I believe that was one of her staffers as well. One of her other staffers quit politics entirely after this event, unfortunately, but she went on to pursue a career that really she was passionate about. You can see here, these are spirits from a local distillery called Republic Restorative. So after the shooting, Pia Carazone, the chief of staff, just left the Hill and created her her own, her own business. And I think that that's, a good example again of adversity, of overcoming adversity. I'll show you this quick video from Gabby Giffords. She recently did a memorial on the National Mall to basically, it was a national gun violence memorial.
Us to speak out. We are at a crossroads. We can let the shooting continue, or we can act. We can protect our families, our future. Please join us in this fight, the fight to stop gun violence.
She was influential in getting bipartisan legislation passing, but those flowers that you see were such an amazing visual. I saw that myself just this past year, and they each represent a person's life here in DC. Now, another person that spoke on the National Mall in the past few years about some gun safety issues was Martin Luther King Jr.'s granddaughter. She's pictured here. Yolanda Renee King is her name. She was just a young girl, and she spoke alongside many of other students from Parkland, Florida. I think it's such an amazing story that we're so used to Martin Luther King speaking and organizing in the Capitol, and here we see his granddaughter doing that as well. Now, talking about Martin Luther King Jr., it's a great opportunity to talk about some of the intersection of civil rights and the women's movement. His memorial right here on the right, that's here in Washington, D.C. And I always say that MLK's legacy is one that is surrounded by women. Down here, this is his wife, Coretta Scott King. This is Shirley Chisholm. This is Eleanor Holmes Norton, who we just learned about. And I want to show you a video from Martin Luther King Jr.'s the dedication ceremony for this memorial. And this is a speech by Cicely Tyson, a really well-known actress, and she has some really beautiful words about women in the civil rights movement.
The story of civil rights movement is the story of the women who at times discreetly, always dedicated, and too often with little recognition, stood up to tear down the barriers between fulfilling the dream and deferring it. The story of the women of the civil rights movement is a story of our mothers, our grandmothers, our widows and wives, our sisters and daughters, who were powerful ravelers down dark, lonely roads on the journey toward freedom and progress. They were pioneers. They were maids, mothers, athletes, volunteers, and entertainers. They were incredible women, such as Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, who worked to make sure all could pursue their dreams. The movement women came in all colors, from all walks of life, to stand with Dr. King and other men of the civil rights movement to map out strategies of change. They were Dorothy Height, Rosa Parks, Betty Shabazz, my dear friend Coretta Scott King, and the countless unknown women who helped to make all our lives more just and more equal.
Cicely Tyson has sort of shown up at so many different events in DC. She also helped dedicate the statue to Mary McLeod Bethune up on Capitol Hill. So I'm going to move through the next couple slides pretty quickly, just to give you an idea of the visuals and how many women have marched for various causes. One of, I think, the most common marches we've seen primarily through the 70s and 80s and up until today have to do with the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment states, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of sex. Here we see this line, some faces you might recognize: Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's our congresswoman, is actually right next to Barbara Mikulski in this picture, but it got cut off. Some of our first ladies, we have Betty Ford and Lady Bird Johnson. Up at the reflecting pool back there is the Washington Monument. The picture is coming from the Lincoln Memorial, as if you were on the steps. Now you see down here, the reason that the marchers are wearing white and they're wearing these sashes are paying tribute to the women's suffragists of the early 1900s. Now we don't have color pictures of them, although there are some that have come to the surface because of some digitalization and whatnot. But just imagine many of these women marching down Pennsylvania Avenue wearing white, purple, gold, holding banners up. When you talk about women's political engagement in the nation's capital, it is absolutely essential to mention that women are the first group to ever march down Pennsylvania Avenue. They do this in the year 1913. They then go on in 1917 to become the first group to ever picket the White House. And you can see them right down there with banners calling out President Wilson during World War I. These women were all aiming for the right to vote. And in 1920, after a very, very, very long struggle, we do see the passage of the 19th Amendment, which says here, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. There were several suffragist movements throughout the city. Here's just a couple of women worth noting: Mary Ann Shadd Cary and Sarah Andrews Spencer, both long before the 19th Amendment, are trying to vote, are often getting meeting challenges, perhaps threatened of arrest and things like that. But two local women who, I'm not going to get too deep into their stories because of time right now, but definitely worth recognizing. And that brings us sort of to modern times and the United States, history recently, 2017, many people might remember this moment, the Women's March. Now, when you talk about women gathering and political engagement, this almost definitely has to be mentioned. In 2017, almost 500,000 plus women gathered in Washington, D.C., hundreds of thousands more gathered on all 7 continents around the world. This is just like the women's suffrage parade of 1913. In fact, you can see how the two pictures are the same. It's the same angle. That's the United States Capitol building down there. The Women's March of 2017 recorded the second highest ridership of the metro train system in its history. So there were over 1 million rides on that day, and that's part of how we measure the large attendance numbers in the city on January 21st, 2017. And last, I will leave you with a little quote from one of our most well-known First Ladies, Eleanor Roosevelt. This statue is here in Washington, D.C. When we talk about women's political engagement in the United States, we've seen that it happens in elected office. We also have seen that it shows up on the streets of D.C. And like, for instance, with the Women's March, it wasn't only in the United States, it spanned across the entire world. Eleanor Roosevelt knew that we must fight not only for American women, but for people and women across the entire globe. She was a delegate to the United Nations. That's what this plaque says right back here. And she was a representative at one of the inaugural meetings to address the status of women across the world. She stands up and she says, she addresses the audience with this quote. She says, "To the women of the world, to this end, we call on the governments of the world to encourage women everywhere to take a more active part in national and international affairs, and on women who are conscious of their opportunities to come forward and share in the work of peace and reconstruction as they did in war and resistance." Thank you very much for hanging out with me during our virtual tour, hear her roar political engagements in Washington, D.C. I hope this inspires you to go vote, go run for office, make any kind of contribution to show up and shape the world that we live in. I haven't really looked at the chat box too much, but I will. With that, I'll just invite Emma and Rebecca back on and we can take some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Caitlin. That was awesome and so wide ranging. And thank you, Rebecca, for also being in the chat and sharing all of those links. So again, if you have a question for Caitlin or Rebecca, please put it in the Q&A and we will be able to see it and talk about it. But just to kind of get us started, I have a question, which is this, again, was so wide ranging. You covered so many topics and time periods and you know, even got a little bit of outside of DC proper. So are there any stories that you wish you could have included in the tour that you didn't get a chance to? And this is a question for both of you.
So many stories. I think the two of us have over 111 stories easily, but you know, I think one of the things that I didn't want to do on this tour was go too much into like women's suffrage, because we talk about that all the time and you can come on any of our tours, and because of the centennial, there's so much information out there. So I try to just kind of stay away from like mainstream things, which makes me nervous, but like, I hope, you know, some of the other stuff kind of was interesting enough. Yeah.
I think it's just, it's impossible to distill all of this down to 90 minutes. I think Caitlin did a really incredible job giving us an overview, but I think as is true with lots of facets of history, there's always more, there's always somebody you wish you could have talked more about. We're constantly sending each other stuff, texts and DMs where it's like, oh my gosh, there's a connection between these two things, or here's a woman we didn't really know about. So it's a process of always learning, always expanding. I think that's what's exciting about the job that we do is you could take a tour with me and then take that same tour a year later, and it could be really different because of what we've discovered and learned and connected to it in that time.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of our tours are just meant to like spark a little bit of interest, you know, here's something and there's more information out there. And absolutely, we missed a lot on this tour, and then we could do it for 10 hours if we had to.
But you covered so much again. And yeah, I think this idea of that what you have to leave out can be almost, if not more complicated a decision than what you put in. I mean, I know that I've experienced that when I've put together projects or, you know, wrote even with a 300-page dissertation that I wrote, I didn't have time to talk about everything. So totally understand. So I guess another question that I have is not so much about this tour, but, you know, your tours in general. It's kind of related to, you know, did you have any other stories? But as tour guides with so much experience, can you tell us a little bit about how you put together a tour?
I'll just jump in quick and pass it to Becca to note that Becca is our vice president of education. So this is like her main role. And it's not just the two of us. We have a team of several tour guides and they all have their unique skills. So Becca, like, how do you actually talk mostly to the tour guides and build our schedule? So what is that like?
I would say that 9 times out of 10, most tours begin with a topic, with an interest. Usually it's somebody has read, seen something that really sparked them into a deep dive on a particular topic. And then we kind of go from there and go, okay, what connects in, what feeds this story, who else can we pull in, how can we diversify the perspective on this? And then we have to look at logistics. Can we walk it? Can we drive it? Can you get there? Is it outside? Is it open? Is it free? I think one thing I really liked about the tour Caitlin did today is it really showcased that the kinds of places we highlight on our tours are not just memorials and statues, but they're street art, murals, call boxes, historic homes, that women's history is often found outside of what we might think of as a traditional historical site. And so when we're building a tour, we're looking at that too, like where are those places and how can we find them? But honestly, a lot of our tours begin with the idea, the concept, and usually that's either an element of women's history that's inspired a guide or a particular woman's story that then we find we can sort of ripple out to tell the story of other women.
Thank you for that explanation. It's I've always kind of been fascinated, having been on a lot of walking tours. I'm always fascinated by how they get put together. So we do have a question from one of our audience members, which is, how did you get started in the tour business? And I guess this can be answered by both of you.
We have like totally different ways in. Mine, my background's in museum education. That's what I came out of college doing. And I always loved history in a public setting, but I didn't ever really think of tour guiding as a job. I was living in DC and I took a tour. I had family in town. It's what you do when you need to like show them around. And I just bugged the tour guide so much, just chatting and talking and, sharing all I knew and asking lots of questions, that at the end, he was sort of like, I have this company and you should come work for me. And that's kind of how it started. So it was a very roundabout way to get into it. But then very quickly, I learned that it is a career, it's a job, it's a really important extension of the public history space. And I think it's grown so much in the last decade with people really interested in sort of experiencing history in the places where history happens. So I really stumbled into it, but I love it. And it's an awesome gig to be in. Caitlin?
In short, I traveled quite a bit. I took some time off from college and traveled. And when I went back to college, I was like, I want to learn history because I was so interested in when I was traveling, the churches, the museums, the memorials, the monuments. I felt like that was how I was learning and absorbing way differently than a classroom. And then when I got my degree in history, again, I didn't really want to be a teacher. So I moved to DC to see what opportunities I had. And I worked in the back end, which is not fun because you're dealing with like people's planes being canceled and losing baggage. And I'm like, no, I don't want to do this. I want to tell stories and I want to be out there with people. And I just have always worked in kind of service forward jobs and I love the interaction. So also kind of a long way to get here, but a fantastic career path for me, I think.
Well, thank you for those answers and thank you for the question. So just because I see that we are at time, I just kind of wanted to ask one more question of the both of you, which is, if you can pick one, and maybe you can't, but if you can pick one, what is your favorite place to go to on a tour in DC that you're leading, the favorite place of yours to show off on a tour?
That's so mean, Emma.
Yeah, I know. We'll tell you when you come on one of our tours. How about that?
That is an excellent response.
You can see 111 of them here.
Yes, that is an excellent response to what is admittedly a kind of very large and complicated question. So thank you for that. And again, thank you for everyone who joined us today. Again, please check out Caitlin and Rebecca's work at A Tour of Her Own, which is atourofherown.com. And you can check out their book, 111 Places in Women's History That You Must Not Miss. And please consider purchasing it from your favorite bookstore or book purveyor, local bookstore, public library, wherever you go. So again, Caitlin and Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us today and leading us on this virtual tour. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. It is our pleasure to spend Sunday afternoons in conversation with inspiring guests in our museum community. And for a full listing of upcoming programs and for registration information, please visit the Public Programs and Events tab at www.womenshistory.org. All events are free, but advanced registration is required. Again, Caitlin, Rebecca, thank you so much. And until next time we meet, please stay safe, please stay healthy, and have a great rest of your Sunday. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.